Welcome to episode 6 of the Cash in Common podcast. I'm here again with my co-host, Roberto Palaccia.
Hey.
And we've got another special guest here as well, a commercial broker, somebody who can tell us a little bit about the commercial real estate industry, Mr. Raymond Chan. And he's a good friend of mine as well, so we've got a lot to talk about. We're going to try and cram it in. Ray's got a hard stop quite soon. We don't have a lot of time, so what we're going to do is we're going to try and cover as much as we can. Specifically, I want to talk initially just Ray. Ray, I'm hoping welcome, by the way.
Oh, thank you so much, Brian.
And listen, we want to get your origin story out so that you can kind of tell people what's going on. Why did you choose commercial real estate? How did you get involved with commercial real estate? Can you just kind of give us your backstory there? You know, I know your history, but we can talk about it.
Okay, well, first off, fun fact, Ryan and I went to the same high school, so shout out to Brebeuf.
Yes.
All my Brebuffians out there. We're here doing big things, and again, thank you so much for having me, Ryan.
There you go, Brebeuf. Right?
There you go, Brebeuf. Talk a bit about my own background. So I started off in finance. I was in commercial banking for a number of years with a Schedule I bank in their real estate group. Always on the lending side and on the risk side, and then eventually, decided, these brokers, they seem to be having a lot of fun. So I went and, I got my license and sort of made a career pivot from the lending to the sales side. And, I've been in commercial brokerage probably for going on 10 years now, so since 2013. And it's been great. I think I've now had the chance to see a couple different cycles. And I can say that, why commercial brokerage? Well, for me, it was a natural transition. I had that finance background, but
Just get a lower mic so we
okay.
can see you don't want your face
right.
bugged.
And then just from that perspective, it's leveraging your skill sets. And I will say this about real estate. It's one of those industries where, it's almost better if you come into it later on in life because you'll come with some other experiences, right? And, I find, I also am a facilitator at Humber. It is one of those industries that draws people from different backgrounds at all different times. So it could be a second or even a third career for some people. But I feel, for me and my transition into commercial real estate really leveraged my banking background and naturally was something I was interested in.
So it was your second career out of your...
Yeah, I'd say so. There was a good number of years with a big green machine. I won't say who, but a big green machine there, and did a lot of great roles with them. And I just felt that sales was something that came somewhat natural, and commercial was something that I could build on.
Okay, just so we can continue just a little bit about the origin story, but
Sure.
What would you say, or do you have any advice for anybody who's thinking about going down your path from, let's say they're moving out of finance and they want to transition in, maybe somebody who's in law that wants to transition into real estate.
Yep.
So you're saying, do you think that that's a smart decision for somebody like that? And what kind of characteristics would you look for in yourself? See if it makes
Absolutely.
sense.
And not to plug my own seminar that I did just a few months ago with Treb.
Plug it away.
It was Introduction to a Career in Commercial Real Estate. And really, it just talked about the different skill sets you need, educational background, those types of qualifications, and really distinguishing within commercial real estate where you want to get into. Do you want to get into the transaction side on brokerage? Do you want to get into analysis and work for a research firm? There's so many different avenues. Or do you want to work for a REIT or something like that where you do more analysis and you're part of a deal team, right? Not just the one conducting the deals themselves.
Mm-hmm.
There's so many different avenues within commercial real estate to venture into, and it really just comes down to the individual and where their skill sets are and where their strengths are. So, I would say at a minimum, in addition to having your license, if you are looking at commercial real estate as a career, always look to those other programs to help strengthen where you could stand to be a bit more specific and learn more about a certain industry, right? So there's a lot of online courses out there, or there's a lot of in-person courses that help you understand a bit more about the nuances of commercial real estate. So always look for further education.
Are you teaching? You teach some of those classes, right?
Well, I did that seminar. It was a one-off I did for Treb, and then my role with Humber is as a facilitator for the commercial, the role play class, the in-person simulation.
So you see people who you would say, okay, that makes sense that they ended up here. That's, based on their sort of stories, right?
Yeah, you see a lot of people, and I think for everyone who's in that program, especially at that point, they are looking to get their license. They are looking to do transactions, and I think that for a lot of them, it could be a complete career change. I think the coolest one I met was there was a radio DJ that wanted to become
cool,
a real estate agent, and I think for them, they're naturally leveraging their network, but then you also have others maybe that were in healthcare. There was a lot of nurses, there were teachers there too,
Right.
that were looking for something to do on the side, or just something to to just broaden their own perspectives and horizons.
Man, I want to go down that path really badly. Like, do you think you can do real estate on the side? Like, can you be a commercial real estate agent on the side, or is that something that's
Great
you know,
question.
what do you think?
I would say commercial real estate is probably one of the ones where it would be better if you were full time, only because there's a lot that gets done during the day that if you did have a regular 9 to 5, you might not be able to service your client as best as possible, right?
Right.
I do think that commercial real estate takes a certain type of commitment towards and especially for your clients, right? I think it really comes down to you being accountable to them and giving them the most that you can out of yourself. So I would say residential, you have more flexibility. You can do showings after work. You can do showings on the weekend. Commercial real estate, just by the nature of it, and especially on the brokerage side, it's probably best to have that as your day job.
Have it as your day job.
Have it
Okay,
as your day
right.
job, for sure.
And so just let's talk a little bit about the climate right now.
Sure.
Let's talk about, in particular, COVID, some of the impacts that it's had. I kind of want to get your sense and your take on what you think has happened to commercial real estate as a result of COVID. And, we can talk specifics about leases in a bit, but I just want to hear, what do you think COVID has done to the commercial real estate industry? Have you seen any recovery? Have you seen changes now? What are your thoughts there?
Absolutely. So I guess at the onset of COVID, so now we're going back almost 3 years to the day, there was a lot of immediate concern for the retail side and for the office side. And both sectors have rebounded considerably since, when people were just exiting leases and not necessarily caring too much about the ramifications going forward. But what I personally saw during COVID was just maybe a refocus of a lot of energies and even ideas. Like, you have people now willing to take that risk to start their own business, right? I did a lot of startups during that time. And, interestingly enough, a lot of them have had some really great success during this period. So a lot of food and beverage actually came about during that time. And then also working on a lot of subleases for office firms looking to, finally have that presence in the downtown core, right?
So
at a bit of a discount, yeah.
And these so where just out of curiosity, where were these food and beverages happening? Was that down in the core of the city, or were you seeing
all
elsewhere?
over? I did deals on all along Yonge Street. There were a few along Bloor, some stuff in Scarborough. So it really, I think what COVID did was it gave people a chance to kind of, do some self-reflection, figure out what they want to do. And if it's starting that bakery that they've always wanted to do, then go for it, right? And
yeah.
I think what also too happened with the early parts of COVID was a lot of prime retail real estate became available. And so that kind of opened up a channel for people to say, okay, well, now if this is available, then maybe this is my time to take advantage of that.
How are things going before COVID started? Like, was there a lot available? How was the pricing then, like before COVID was even known, to now being that we're kind of on the other end of things? Yeah,
it definitely went through a period of stabilization. Prior to COVID, it was really hard to get, some quality leases for these startups, right? And moreover, a lot of landlords probably weren't willing to take that chance on a startup, right? What COVID did was it really did open up a lot of opportunities for other people to get into the industry. And so not just, food and beverage, but even, startup companies that are wanting to secure space in a downtown office core building, a Class A building might not have been available because the demand was always there and the landlords were a bit more, I don't want to say picky, but they were a bit more selective at that time in terms of who they would be letting in. And so, I think it really has had, a very varying degree of impact, but in a lot of ways, a very positive one too.
So was there a change then because I know we talk a little about, like, that's leases you're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Or you're not talking specifically about purchases and sale, but I imagine during COVID there was a decrease in purchase for commercial real estate, or was that just sort of a shift out of certain areas in your view?
Yeah, from a transaction point of view, like the investment side has always been desirable, and specifically, like, and this is going even before COVID, on the industrial side, that type of commercial real estate has always been sought after, and so that didn't change. And in fact, during COVID, that just made it that much more harder to get this type of industrial space because supply chains are changing. People want to produce locally. All these factors have made industrial, continue to stay on top in terms of commercial real estate. Your small commercial condo, transaction-wise, that's always going to be there. And I think, a lot of us small business owners, we need spaces like that, right?
For sure.
So I think COVID, in a sense, did just kind of, again, accelerate that type of interest. Someone was willing to take a chance on themselves and to steal a line from Fred VanVleet, bet on yourself, right? And so in that respect, like, you have those opportunities now. Why not go for it? So on the investment side, I'd still say it was fairly active for the smaller investor, but the larger players would, in what I saw, take a step back, right? A lot of it because the way you value commercial properties is based on their tenancies and their lease agreements, right? If they're not generating a certain type of return or cap rate, why would you invest in that? So
right.
I think it was varying again in terms of which spectrum you're looking at it.
So price per square foot. So if if you had a vacant, so in other words, what you're saying is if there were vacancies in that building. Mm-hmm. This building, for instance, I mean, you can. This is a good example. I mean, we got this space. The previous tenant here was, you guys can't see the building itself, but this unit, it's not very big, but this was a driving school before. Oh, wow. It was a driving school, and then the tenant signed the lease just before COVID, intended to use it as a driving school, and then never used it as a driving school because right. Nobody ever came out during right. COVID. And so now he was stuck with a lease for 2 years where we had nobody. So it was basically a vacant unit mm-hmm. with a tenant that never, right? Like that was a tenancy, but nobody was ever in the unit, right? And that's, I think, pretty common. I think that's probably pretty common with a lot of places. It's just sort of like you had specific businesses that lend themselves to being in person, all of a sudden no longer needing to be in person, that are now shifting to this, shifting away from having any space at all or reducing the space that they do have. So that sort of connects to this article that, there's an article that I was just looking at here in the Financial Post, and it's an article about Shopify and how Shopify essentially is become one of the biggest subtenants in the entire commercial market, and subtenancies now. So, you're talking a little bit about that, but mm-hmm. Subtenancies seem to be a pretty good option for people who are now currently want to get into the market, but they might be challenging to find, if I understand that correctly.
Absolutely, and that's not to my own horn, but certainly the industry in general. Like, that's where the value of a commercial broker really comes into play, because a lot of these subtenancies are available, but they're available exclusively. So what I mean by exclusively, it's not on Realtor.ca, typically not on any public site, but when working with proper office brokers, they will have these listings, and a lot of times too, you may have a landlord that doesn't want all the publicity to advertise that, hey, this tenant is now exiting the space, or it may be the tenant themselves that they don't want that necessarily.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That attention or that spotlight. So the value of a commercial broker comes into play in these instances because they are hooked up, they are in the network, they are in the know of which spaces are available. And to your point earlier, you could get some fantastic deals. I won't mention specifics, but one deal that I had that I did personally was the sub landlord. So the sub landlord was an institution that had close to 5,000 square feet of space, and my client, who was now the subtenant, they were able to get it for almost 75% off.
Oh my God, that's crazy.
The net rate. Wow. So, and again, with subtenancies, there typically is a shorter time frame. So the tenants themselves may be willing to help front a bit of the cost to get someone in, because really it's about, if you're at that point of actually looking at a sublease, or if you're the tenant looking to become a sublandlord, you're probably at that point where either you exit and you take something or you get something from it, or you're just sitting on, like Ryan was saying, vacant property for a period of time, right? So a lot of these instances do happen, and so a startup can really benefit from having that that lower rent to start, and then we'll see what happens in a year and a half's time when that actual lease agreement is up, the one with the landlord, and do they decide to stay, or do they realize that maybe they don't need the space, right? So there's a lot of different things at play, but at the same time, they're I guess there is opportunity.
Yeah. And you think landlords are renegotiating, lowering their rents to keep someone like that subtenant there, or would that be probably not the case?
Probably not the case, only because they would have been receiving the rents that they're used to receiving because
Right.
there was that tenant in place, making up that difference.
Sure.
So,
Right. And there's an agreement there. Obviously, they got to honor, right?
exactly. So they haven't seen any sort of dip in terms of what they're receiving. So to see them offer, what would have been the old subtenant a reduced rate to match what they were getting on a sublease, I don't see that happening. But again,
So now that we're like on the other side of COVID, and returning to work for big corporations that have probably filled up loads of buildings downtown, do you think there's going to be more of these deals? Because I know return to work in an office face to face is going really slowly for many big companies, financial institutions, like all the people that take up the core buildings that along King and Bay and all that. Like, do you feel like there's going to be more opportunities for subletting at a great price? Like, obviously, it sounds like Shopify is taking advantage of that, but do you feel like there's going to be more maybe opportunity for maybe smaller companies than Shopify to take that opportunity?
yeah, absolutely. I think what's going to be really interesting to see is when a lot of these actual lease agreements expire. So say one of the big banks is moving and their lease ends in 2025, right? Just to pick, typically they end in 5s and 10s and whatnot. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing what's going to happen in 2025 when a lot of these agreements that have been signed for multi-years at a time, when those agreements actually expire, then you have landlords in a position where now they need to attract new tenants. So what do they do with the space? Do they chop it up into smaller floor plates, or do they, is this a time that someone looks at the entire building as an opportunity to do a conversion or repurpose? I think that's going to be very interesting to see in the coming years. And I think the banks and other financial institutions, they'll play a role in all this, because as they exit the core space into maybe some newer buildings for efficiencies, like what's going to happen with these legacy buildings that have been around for decades, that have all this infrastructure already built into them. So
There are a lot of downtown buildings that are looking at conversion, or have you heard of any like whispers of conversions happening in buildings, big buildings downtown?
Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't say there's a lot of chatter, but I do think that at a certain point, for maybe some of not the Class A buildings, but the Class B buildings, where it's always been a struggle to get tenants in,
Right.
maybe they look at an exit strategy, right? Because your location is not going to change. It's always going to be location. If you're already downtown, if you already have a certain footprint, maybe it is more something to look at in terms of a residential side, right? Or another use. But I do think that it's not necessarily going to be your Class A buildings that will have to undergo this sort of dynamic shift, but more your Class B buildings, which there's still a ton in the downtown core.
Interesting. What do you think is, so let's just talk about investing very quickly with respect to commercial real estate. Could you maybe talk a little bit about why someone should invest in commercial versus residential? Like if they're trying to make a decision, should I get a commercial building? Should I get a residential property? And they're trying to enter the market.
Mm-hmm.
Is there advantages or disadvantages to doing it as commercial? I'm sure there are advantages. What are those disadvantages and advantages if you're investing in commercial versus residential?
So I would say, as a private investor investing into commercial, like one thing you have to realize is that there's two components to your rent, right? So there's your net rent, and then there's the TMI component, which your tenant pays. So what effectively a commercial rent does, or a commercial investment does for you, is that you can just all you have to worry about is collecting your net rent. Your TMI is paid by the tenant, and in many ways they're the ones kind of taking care of your building, the upkeep. So a lot of the things that are improvements to your building are paid for by the tenant. So in instances like that, I do feel it's a very carefree type of investment for an investor. Whereas on the residential side, you may have a tenant that is constantly asking you, "Oh, can you fix this? Can you fix that?" And you probably on the residential side will have a bit more of a responsibility, or you may feel a bit more ownership to get something repaired or fixed. But on the commercial side, there's a bit of a distinction between what the tenant is responsible for and what the owner is responsible for. And I'll say this too: commercial tenancies are typically longer. So if you don't want to always have to like constantly go through new tenants and whatnot on the residential side. You're signing someone up typically for a 5+5, or in certain instances, like when you're working
15
a lot
years,
with,
20
well,
years,
a doctor or
50 years.
dentist will probably want at least 10+10, right?
Sure.
Just to
Right.
build up their patient base. So it is important when you are entering into commercial leases to look at escalations as well, so that your lease doesn't look ridiculous in a few years, right? You want to be able to kind of keep up with market. So I do feel like the commercial side lends itself to a bit more planning, a bit more stability. But then you also have commercial tenants sometimes not making it, right? Like if their business
Right.
goes bust, then you're in the same position. So I think those are some of the pros and cons of commercial tenancy. And certainly, just temper expectations. Like on the residential side, we've seen a lot of appreciation and a lot of growth there. Like commercial side, it's a bit more stable, and so you're really in it for the long run.
Yeah, you're in it for the long run. Then you kind of also need, you need to set up tenancies that really, that are favorable in the long term, right?
Mm-hmm.
For instance, like we talked about with respect to these subtenant circumstances, if you're a landlord, you're likely going to want to ensure that a subtenant couldn't then, a sub-landlord couldn't then profit off of a subtenancy circumstance, because that really is going to leave you in a bind potentially if you need to find new tenants, right? So it's just like subtleties in your lease are going to be like super key, because commercial tenancies don't operate under the same rules
Right.
as residential tenancies, right? We don't have the Residential Tenancies Act. You have the Commercial Tenancies Act, which really, I don't know, not a lot there with respect to specifics between tenants and landlords. I mean, you could basically...
Well, that's why you need a good real estate lawyer.
Well,
right?
yeah, I'm not trying to plug myself. I'm saying it's important that you think about these elements and
Right.
and you get them down on paper, because if you don't, then you could really run in. It's a broad stroke sort of setup, and if you're creative with the way you think, then good. But you've got to really nail down the details in a commercial tenancy. It's kind of different than residential tenancies. Just something for people to think about.
Yeah,
Think
absolutely.
about if they're going to do it. But on the finance side, I guess, Rob, I don't know if you have anything there to say with respect to what it's like. I know it's not your specialty, but I'm sure you see
I deal
some
with
of these things
more
come
small
around,
commercial lending. I think there's a big gap in the market for small commercial lending, as you probably know that, Ray. Like working for the Big Green Machine, like they don't start looking at files or deals unless they're like over $2 million.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Like most of the major lenders don't do a lot of the small commercial lending, and what you tend to find with small commercial spaces is that they'll be very like either small plazas or mixed use properties, which are huge, across the city
For sure.
and a lot, especially like older plazas have a lot of those apartments upstairs or in the back kind of thing, and a storefront, and those they offer their own challenges from a lending perspective, but there are lenders that will work with you on smaller loans. I've never understood why a lot of lenders don't want to really go into the commercial lending space unless it is like worth a lot more. To me, I feel like it's a bit of a mystery, because I feel like there's always opportunity to earn money. Like, why wouldn't these institutions want to deal with that? I'm assuming it has to do with the stability and the energy that goes into actually underwriting these files. So like it has to be sort of worth it.
Yeah.
And so that's what my feeling is around that. But from a small commercial perspective, small commercial properties offer great opportunities to own commercial property, and you can get best of both worlds. Location is so key though when we get into that, because marketability on small commercial properties are very low, like in the sense that you're not going to have a lot of people that are going to be looking for those properties. So as from the lending perspective, they tend to take on a little more risk, because you're not going to have a big company like Shopify or RBC wanting to buy a small little plaza with like tenants in the back. Like they don't want to deal with any of that.
Right.
If they're going to operate their business out of there, they are going to look for a building in the suburbs or downtown and like want to lease out a part of it. Like it would be more of a grander scale. And then of course from private small investor, again, they're usually looking at multiplex units, residential properties. So the whole like small plaza or small building with like mixed use, it's just there's a less of a crowd that it gets attracted to, right? So that's probably why you don't have like the big banks dealing with them in general. We have a handful of lenders that would do it. I've done it, quite a few of them around the city, and I think it's a great opportunity to own. You get the stability of a small business in there. You can also operate a business out of there, which is great too, and then have tenants help.
And you're saying there for like private investors, so people want to like if you're gonna, because you can lend, I guess, to somebody who wants to buy something small, right? So under $2 million, that might be, like you're saying, a storefront with 2 units upstairs. I guess you'd be digging deep into tenancies there, like what tenancies are in place, what kinds of income are you looking at?
Well, the funny thing is, like, the residential units tend to be the backbone of the deal, right? Because
really?
Well, yeah, there's such a demand. You're going to
okay.
have people continuously wanting to be in there, and then the business you're buying that's already in there, or the one you're going to fill in, they're going to be a small business.
Yeah.
They might be a startup, and so when you're leasing out, you're kind of taking on a little more of a risk there. And of course there's the money that needs to be spent to set up their business. Like, sometimes if you really want a really great tenant, you might help out with the cost of building out their business, right? Because they're actually making physical they're making physical changes to your property.
Yeah, that's going to improve the value.
For the most part, it should improve it. Yeah, exactly.
Do the right thing.
So so there's always this, like, I think there's a little more
velvet walls are not going to work. That's not going to be
so I think from a lending perspective, it really depends what you're dealing with. A lot of planning goes into commercial files. I know, Ray, you could probably speak to this a lot.
And maybe even just to jump in, like, one word that you said earlier, Rob, was just risk, right? There's a lot more risk involved. And so even from a financing perspective, it's, as long as you can mitigate the risk, it's great. But what happens when it's your owner who is operating their bakery downstairs and they live upstairs, right? What happens to the bakery if, what happens to your tenant or yourself? Like, if you're paying the mortgage, what happens to your mortgage if your bakery doesn't do well? Right. So there's a lot of risk that goes into each file, and it's just how it's mitigated and how it's managed. And so, like, I think the appetite, from a small business banking perspective, it will always be there, but banks are also very cautious in who they lend to and what ideas are put forth. So I think that's probably why, from a transaction perspective, you just don't see as much financing done for those. And then also too, like, from an underwriting perspective, it's a lot more work, right? Like, if you're lending to a small business, then now you're obligated to get financial statements, and then you're analyzing these statements and making sure that you're not only is your loan in okay, but you're obviously your client too. So probably a lot more work involved in small business, but definitely worth it. Like, that's sort of the backbone of our industry, right?
Cool. Well, Ray, listen, I'm mindful of time here. We got 3 minutes left. I know you got to go. If there's anything you want to sort of close off on here, I'm just going to open the floor to you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, like, one thing that I truly believe in, and if not evidenced through the course, that seminar that I put together, I do think that there should be more commercial brokers out there. So I'm saying this to the population in general, and specifically those with your license. Like, think about commercial real estate, only because it elevates you in terms of your own experience, what you'll understand about business, what you'll understand about the economy, but also too, I think it's much needed. There's so many businesses out there that could use proper representation, and so a good commercial broker will offer that. And speak to your brokerages. There should be training programs in place, but feed that curiosity on your own. Take courses. Take the next steps to sort of differentiate yourself from other agents and other realtors out there. So my ending comments would just be on seriously consider commercial real estate. I think it's a great space once you've got your network, once you have picked a specialty. There's so many different avenues where you can pursue, and just use this license that you have as a gateway.
Cool.
Yeah, I think that speaks a lot about you, Ray. I mean, you're encouraging people to compete with you, right?
Well, that's the
Or are
thing.
they coming to work for your brokerage?
Either,
What's going
either
on?
or. I mean, I'm not being specific, but I do think that there's a great opportunity for people out there
Yeah,
to
I think
grow.
diversifying yourself too as a realtor. I mean, obviously the residential market has taken huge hits, right? We're down
Yeah.
like 40% year over year as far as sales volume. So there's a lot of realtors, I'm sure, that aren't doing
Sure,
as many
absolutely.
transactions.
Yeah.
So I think
absolutely.
I think you're right. I mean, diversifying is always a great thing.
And then, as on the tenant side, I would
Yeah.
also say, you know, I can speak to the fact that having a commercial broker in your corner is helpful, right? It's really going to get you the deals that you wouldn't ordinarily have seen. It's going to put you in places you might not have expected you would have even looked at. And you know, there's lots of opportunities there. So as a someone having a commercial tenancy myself, I'd say probably not a bad idea. Get involved with a commercial broker, get one on your side, so they can help you find a tenancy that makes sense for you. So.
That's great.
Yeah, on that note, this is the end of our 6th episode of the Cash in Common podcast. And we look forward to seeing you guys again soon.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks
Ray.
Ray, for coming out.
Thanks.